Mike Jones is an independent journalist, an Englishman abroad, not just abroad, but an expat in Moscow, in Russia. My goodness. What's that like, Mike Jones? Thanks for joining us again. It's a while since you've been on the show, but we did meet in Kazan at the BRICS conference, and you were in fine form. I probably asked you this then, but let me ask it again for the viewers. What's it like being an Englishman in Russia these days?
Well, in my opinion, and from what we discussed in Kazan, I think being an Englishman in Russia is better than being an Englishman in England, quite frankly, particularly when it comes to liking certain posts on Facebook, if you're that way inclined.
I'm not hearing you, but I think that the audience did. So I'll take as read what you just said there, Mike, and ask for your reaction to the increased animosity. I think I could put it more strongly than that. The very ferocious relationship that now exists between the Russian state and the British state. I mean, we've got this ludicrous, utterly ludicrous light opera over the tragic death of Don Sturgis in the Salisbury Novichok case going on, leading to a stream of vicious commentary against Russia. You've got British diplomats being kicked out of Moscow as spies. You've got relations really at rock bottom. Does the ordinary man and woman in the street in Russia know about this, and what's their take on it?
Yeah, I agree that relations have been the worst than I've ever known, ever recalled, diplomatically speaking. From the normal person on the streets, still in general, there's still a very amicable relationship, curiosity, even, as I've reported since 2018. That sentiment, though, is getting worse. I've just through other friends, when they mentioned that they had a British friend, the father was a bit like, "Oh no, we don't like British people." Now that's one person, and that's the first case in the years I've been here that I've heard that, and I think that is the sort of amping up the rising of these difficulties in the relationship and the disgusting attitude of not just the likes of Keir Starmer and his predecessors, who have been so hawkish, so bellicose against Russia, but these underhanded activities, not just espionage being conducted from embassies where these diplomats, as you say, are being expelled, where their activities been uncovered, which is for the second time that I've read in the news that this has occurred, but then also to storm shadow these actual British-made, manufactured munitions now flying deep into Russian territory, given this hugely escalatory rhetoric that's come out recently from the US and the UK. UK always denying any culpability, in fact, any involvement in Ukraine. So this two-sided, this speaking from, the side of the mouth of things is just making the British and Westerners in general untrustworthy for Russians, and they want, ideally they'd want things to be better, but we both know, and they're resigned to the fact that they aren't going to get any better anytime soon with the current leadership in charge.
Well, anytime soon, meaning the last 150 years, really, since the Crimean War. I mean, we even betrayed the Russian royal family. I'm just reading about it at this very moment. We were supposed to give asylum to the Tsar and the Tsarina and all their unfortunate children who were all then massacred. And that's because the British reneged on a deal that we were going to take them and make sure they didn't interfere in Russian politics and so on. It's a very ugly story, the Anglo-Russian story. And even in that very brief period, when we were comrades in arms in the Second World War, and Churchill praised Stalin and the Red Army so effusively, King George sent a victory sword to Moscow. Even in that period, the British were intriguing and conspiring as to how they were going to cut the Russians down to size after the Second World War. I mean, I'm actually thinking, and of course I'm not young, I doubt if real diplomatic relations, again in my lifetime, will be visible in between London and Moscow. Is that how it feels to you?
Absolutely, I'd agree 100%. In fact, now the British are referred to as just Anglo-Saxons. And that has a certain connotation to it, as you can imagine, when it's communicated to Russian people. The Anglo-Saxons were, in history, we're told they're very aggressive, not to be trusted, and dirty. You got these kind of backward connotations, as you rightly say. When you said about these relationships, yeah, it was 9 times out of 10, it was the British that backstabbed the Russians. Let's not forget that after the Bolshevik Revolution, it was Britain that supplied the White Army. The very first tank that the Red Army ever got hold of was a British tank that was captured from the Whites. And all the time, the British, throughout history, have put their hands back and said, we're not involved, we're not doing anything. And yet they are very clearly one of the sort of main components of these problems. St. Petersburg suffering numerous raids by the Royal Navy, along with the Swedes. The Winter War, Britain was going to send troops in to assist the Finns against the Red Army, against Stalin at the beginning, before the Soviets joined in on the Allies. So Britain has been at the forefront of causing these problems with relations. And now we have the combination of the US. You've just touched on, well, you've gone into great depth actually about Hunter Biden's pardon. This is a huge signal, certainly for Russian people, almost an admission from the United States, particularly Joe Biden, that the United States was meddling in Ukraine. We know the UK as well, among others, from 2014. So this whole facade of this just started with Putin waking up one day in a bad mood is thrown out the window. So we have a legal acknowledgement that meddling was going on from 2014, and viewers may be reminded that Euromaidan took place 21st of November on to February of 2013, 2014. So there is a blatant admission almost from the West there, in this panic almost to cover up. If they're covering up Burisma, what else are they covering up? Because we had biolabs that was scoffed at by the US, later admitted by Newland. It's just confirmation from the Russian people on just this one point alone, if you take it from there, that their leader was right. And the US president now kind of admitting it. The one point I also make, which was really put across Russian media, is that Hunter Biden can no longer plead the Fifth. And that was one of my first thoughts as well. This might be a pardon for Hunter Biden. It's not going to protect Big Daddy Joe, and it's not going to protect any others that are going to be investigated. I hope they're going to be investigated by Trump. And therefore, Hunter could be a key witness because he can no longer incriminate himself. So for Russians, this is, again, another confirmation that the US is not only to blame, involved. The corruption that they were told about, quite rightly, did indeed exist. And yeah, they're on the right path. When it comes to talks about Trump's, there's like 3 components. This freezing of lines, not going to happen. You can't trust Ukraine. You can't trust NATO. Merkel admitting that any ceasefire was just to build up Ukraine. It's pretty much been said as well, even in this new deal, that they would try and rearm Ukraine. Kellogg putting in that a threat that if Putin doesn't negotiate, they'll increase aid to Ukraine. That's not gonna fly. So there's a lot of pessimism moving forward, particularly even into Trump's administration from Russia. They just don't trust the West at all. And in my opinion, neither should they.
Well, let's stay at the head of the dog. We've dealt enough with the tail of the dog, to which you and I both adhere as British people. But at the head of the dog, you're now soon, in the next few weeks, going to have Donald Trump. He never struck me as a forgiving sort of guy. So to me, it would be inconceivable if he were now to turn nice guy and allow the Biden crime family to go off into pretty short retirement I'd warrant. It's much more likely that Trump will seek to open the books. And you're absolutely correct to identify the biolabs. It's not just Burisma. Hunter Biden's business in Ukraine included the construction of biolabs. Of all the gin joints in all the world that Hunter Biden could have walked into and set up a biolab, he decided to set them up in Ukraine. Now, you don't need to be Einstein to work out why Ukraine, even way back then in 2014, because the Ukrainian people and the Russian people are the same people. I mean, they are genetically, not to mention historically, the same people. That's why this war is so ugly. It's a civil war, effectively. And they were using these biolabs to test the skin common to both Russian and Ukrainian people for the better deployment of biological and chemical weapons against Russia in some future conflict. Trump would be extremely stupid not to uncover these secrets, wouldn't he? Because they will destroy the Democratic Party in the United States for maybe decades to come.
Yeah, I agree, and it's not even just the Democratic Party. We know it's not just one party that's sort of involved in all this. The deep state globalist, whatever you want to call them, are very much behind it, and we're seeing a lot of desperation, I see, in these seemingly ill-advised moves that are only serving to expose themselves. But as you say, it's panicked. They don't have much time left. Trump coming in has promised a lot. And again, I'll lend back to this pessimism that is certainly over here in Russia. Whether he delivers, obviously, it was going to be rhetoric. It was always going to be rhetorical when Trump said, I'll end this in 24 hours. We can forgive him for that. But to even in some of his statements talk about sort of forcing Putin, forcing Russia, that's not going to happen, and that cannot. The United States is not in a position to dictate such terms. If Trump does go back through, and I hope brings the people to justice that need to be, not just to justice, but also exposed for all their crimes against not just the Ukrainian people, but the American people as well. That's hugely important. Trump's going to face a difficult job, both internally and also some of his advisors. There's questions about that. It's something we can all hope for, but unfortunately, there's a lot of pessimism, and I share some of that as well, because how deep do you go, and how much of this rot do you expose?
Well, whether this ends on Trump's plan or on the battlefield, it's only going to end when absolute neutrality of Ukraine is guaranteed, not promised, but guaranteed. It's only going to end when there's a Russian-friendly government in Kiev rather than a Russian hostile government. And as you know from our previous conversations, it's only going to end when great Russian cities like Kharkov and Odessa are liberated and returned to the motherland. And so, I mean, if this takes 3 months, 6 months, there won't be much left to negotiate about, will there?
Absolutely not. And what's particularly disgusting in recent news being broadcast in Russia is the admission, I believe it was an admission by the US, of demanding Zelensky lower the mobilization age to 18. These are really sort of last days of the Reich, mandates that are being set out there for Zelensky to enact. And it's really quite disgusting to see. And they're being quite open about it. Thankfully, not many countries that I know of in NATO are really for Ukraine ever joining NATO. They might say, obviously, Latvia and Estonia, these ones are very welcoming for Ukraine, as we can understand. But the real players in NATO, they're not for it. They don't have the stomach for that. They're willing to deceive Ukraine and give platitudes, as we've seen in the past, but that's never really an option. Alexander Dugin, the prominent philosopher in Russia, has written a good article on Substack about what he calls the conservative revolution going around the world. And in it, he talks along these lines where there cannot be any compromises, really. As you've said, the Russian cities need to come back to Russia. There will be no freezing of the conflict along any lines whatsoever outside of the Russian territories. All the talk I've seen, certainly in the Western media, is along current lines or lines at the date of negotiations. That's never going to fly. And President Putin, Lavrov, Zakharova, Medvedev have all been absolutely clear. There will be perhaps an agreement along the lines that came close to fruition in Istanbul. They might build upon that framework, but that is the only way it's going to work. And there cannot be any compromise from Russia. That would be more devastating for Putin, particularly, to give any compromise in his standing than it would be for anything that the West can throw at him. One sort of tiny warning in the back of my mind, there's a lot of talk in the Western media about Russian interference, particularly as we're seeing now in Georgia and Tbilisi. I would just like to highlight to people the similarities between Euromaidan in Ukraine and what's going on in Georgia. We heard very similar talk in Ukraine, where they wanted closer EU integration, and then these prolonged protests supported by the West with the different rhetoric. These people, despite Yanukovych being the democratically elected, these people were the saviors of the country, trying to bring to the EU. We're seeing the same in Georgia now as well. And one clue there is this foreign agent law. You'll see it pop up even in Western media as a bone of contention, this real pain point. And that is precisely because Georgia doesn't want the NGOs in there. And this is where the West is losing its power. So this, again, I see as a last-ditch effort. The fact that Russia has, President Putin praised the Georgian Dream Party directly for protecting their sovereignty and standing up for their country, the West has taken to mean, oh, yeah, it's confirmation of Russian interference. Absolutely not. This has all the stamps and hallmarks, and this is an attempt to open up another front. I believe we're seeing similar in Syria, where the Russian aerospace forces are helping the Syrians. They have done for years. So it's seemingly opening up all these fronts as the Ukrainian line collapses. The gains that the Russian army has made in 2024 has exceeded all that Ukraine allegedly gained in their offensive, as they called it. The territorial losses and obviously the human and material is so staggering at the moment. I see these other areas and fronts being opened up as the West realizes that this is absolutely going to they're going to end on Russia's terms and nothing else.
Now, finally, the world's greatest journalist, broadcaster, biggest broadcaster by far and away, Tucker Carlson, is in Moscow right now. He has concluded an interview with Mr. Lavrov, the world's greatest foreign minister. Almost everyone would agree on that. What do you hear on the street about how that interview went and what we might expect when Tucker's interview drops?
Actually, Tucker's done a very good job. He did with President Putin. He's done the same with Sergei Lavrov, where he's kept things quite close and guarded. Russian media, of course, have shared that, and I think they're optimistic and looking forward to it. They're quite excited. Tucker's done. You can think what you will about Tucker, but he's done so much more than even politicians and diplomats have done in the West in reaching out to Russia. I advise people to check out his sort of teaser, if you will, about it. He, like many other people, is horrified at the state of diplomatic affairs. And he, after his interview with Lavrov, said, there are no back channels. This is how dangerous it is. And this is far worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I do agree with Tucker. When it comes to Lavrov, I expect it will be a masterclass. Sergei Lavrov hasn't failed to impress in the past, and I don't expect he's going to start doing it now. I think Tucker Carlson has done an excellent job and choice of interviewee. One thing I will stress in his little teaser as well, he has stated that for the past year, he has tried to reach out and interview President Zelensky, and the US government has explicitly blocked them, and said Zelensky can be interviewed by CNBC et al., but under no conditions can it be Tucker Carlson. And that was a big point for Russian people to hear as well.
Yeah, it shows just how independent a country Zelensky's Ukraine is, where the US State Department can order the president not to be interviewed by a named American journalist. The teaser that Tucker's put out has something like 20 million views already, just on the teaser. Wait till we see the interview. Mike Jones, as always, thanks very much for joining us on the mother of all talk shows.